Hello, boys and girls. I am here to tell you the first lesson for the Great Escape. And I told you that the word for the day is promise. And we talked about how God's promises are different from our promises, right? Because our promises are easily broken, but God's promises can never be broken. And then I told you that I was going to tell you about Abraham. And to tell you about Abraham, I'm going to tell you about the promises that God made to Abraham because Abraham believed God and he obeyed him. And God called him his friend. Now, the first promise that God made to Abraham was that he was going to make of him a great nation. This nation would be so big that it'd be like the stars of the sky or like the sand on the beach, and you wouldn't be able to count all of it. But what did he mean by that? That he was going to make of Abraham a great nation. He meant his children and his children's children and his children's children's children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and so on, would become this great nation. Now, Abraham did not own the land that he lived on. He was living in tents, and they traveled around. But the second promise that God made to Abraham was that all of this land would belong to that nation that was going to come from him. It would all belong to his descendants. And then the third promise he made to Abraham, through this nation that would come from Abraham, all the world would be blessed. Then a little bit later, God gave him another promise, and it said that this nation would, for a time, would be in another nation, and they would be slaves to this other nation. But after 400 years, God would visit them and God would show his power and he would bring them out of that other nation. So those are the promises that God gave to Abraham. And we're going to see how God kept all of those promises this week. In our stories this week, our lessons this week, we're going to see how God kept all those promises. But Abraham did not see the promises because they were for this nation that was going to come out of him. So Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Abraham passed the promises on to Isaac. So Abraham didn't see the promises fulfilled, so he passed those promises on to Isaac. And then Isaac had twin sons, and he passed the promises on to his younger son, Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. and he passed the promises on to all of his sons. Now, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So we call his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons the children of Israel. Sometimes we call them the Hebrews. And during Jacob's lifetime, one of his sons was sold into slavery into Egypt. His name was Joseph. But later, Joseph became the second ruler of the land of Egypt because he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. And Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream. And he told him that there was going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And he suggested to Pharaoh that he choose someone to oversee collecting the grain from the 7 years of plenty, so that when they got to the 7 years of famine, when food wouldn't grow, that's what a famine is, that they would still have food. And so Pharaoh chose Joseph, and he made him the second ruler in the land. Well, later, Joseph's brothers came to get food because they had heard that there was food in Egypt. And the second time that they came to get food, Joseph showed them who he was. And he told them to bring their families because there were still several years of famine left. And so Jacob and all of his children and his grandchildren moved to Egypt. Does this sound familiar? God said that Abraham's descendants would be in a foreign land for a certain amount of time. Now they have moved to Egypt, which is a foreign land. And now we come to today's story. In today's story, this is after Joseph and his brothers had all died out, but the nation, the children of Israel, have multiplied. And there are so many of them that you can't hardly count them. Wait, that's a promise, right? So, Pharaoh, the new Pharaoh, didn't remember Joseph. He never knew Joseph. And so, he was afraid of the Israelites, the children of Israel, the Hebrews, we call them sometimes. And so, he decided to make them slaves. And he thought if he made them slaves and they had to work really hard, they wouldn't have any time to have more children. And maybe that would stop them from growing so fast. Stop this nation from growing so fast. Because he was afraid that if they were fighting against an enemy, the children of Israel might fight on the enemy's side. And he didn't want that, because that would overpower them. But you know what? Even though they were slaves, they still kept multiplying. till there were more and more and more of them. So the next thing he did was he told the midwives. Do you know what a midwife is? A midwife is someone who helps a woman when she's going to have a baby. All right? He told the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Do you like those names? Those are sort of strange names. That if they were helping a Hebrew woman with her baby, if the baby was a boy, to kill it. And if it was a girl, they could let it live. But you know, the midwives, they didn't want to do that. They feared God, and they thought it was wrong to kill babies. And so they didn't do it. So Pharaoh called them back in and asked them why they weren't killing the baby boys. And they told him a story about how Hebrew women are faster than Egyptian women, and they have their babies faster before the midwife even gets there. And so God, because they would not kill the baby boys, God blessed them and gave them families, gave them children. So the next thing Pharaoh did was he ordered that all the Hebrew babies that were boys would be thrown into the Nile River. He meant they would drown in the river, right? He wanted them to be killed. Well, one day, a man named Amram and his wife Jochebed had a baby boy. And this baby boy was so wonderful. I know every mother thinks that her baby boy is wonderful, right? But this baby boy was so wonderful. And she tried to keep him. She tried to hide him. Maybe she dressed him in pink so they wouldn't think he was a boy. I don't know. But she tried to hide him. But after 3 months, she couldn't hide him anymore because he was crying so loud and anybody could find him. And so she thought, what can I do? So she made him a basket and she put it in the river. She put tar on the outside of the basket so it would float. And she put the baby in the basket and put a lid on the basket, and she put it in the bulrushes on the edge of the river. And then she sent her daughter, Miriam, out to watch the basket. And so Miriam was watching that basket and watching that basket to see what was going to happen. And then the Egyptian princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, came down to the river with her maids. And as she was getting ready to take her bath in the river, that's what they were doing, this basket somehow worked its way out of the weeds, out of the bulrushes. Maybe a wind blew it out. And the princess saw the basket. And she sent one of her maids to get it. And so the maid brought the basket to the shore. And she opened it up. And the baby started crying. And the princess and all the maids said, "Oh, it's one of the Hebrew children." And the princess took the baby in her arms she she was enamored with this baby. She wanted to keep it. And Miriam spotted that. And so Miriam ran up to her and said, "Do you want me to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you?" And the princess thought, "Yes, I do want you to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for me." She had decided she was going to keep this baby. And so, who do you suppose Miriam went and got? She went and got her mother, the baby's mother, Jochebed. And she brought her to the Egyptian princess. And the Egyptian princess told her, "Here, take this baby and nurse it for me till it's old enough. And I'll pay you wages. I'll pay you money for taking care of it. And then when it's old enough, you can bring it to the palace and I'll make it my own son." And so that's what happened. So Jochebed took her own baby and she was paid to take care of it until he was old enough to go to the palace. And the princess named the baby Moses because she drew him out of the river. And that's what Moses means. So, tomorrow we're going to see what happens as Moses grows up. And he looks around him and he sees what's going on. But first, we're going to have a second lesson today. But this one is about Jesus.